War is commonly described as disorder, a rupture in reason, a breakdown of diplomacy, a tragedy born of miscalculation. This interpretation is comforting. It allows societies to believe that violence erupts when restraint fails, rather than when incentives align. Yet history, when examined without sentiment, tells a far more unsettling story. Wars do not merely happen. They follow patterns, and patterns, by definition, are not accidents. This is not an argument about morality. It is not an accusation against soldiers, nor a dismissal of sacrifice. It is an inquiry into structure. Because beneath every great conflict lies an economic architecture that predates the first shot and outlives the final treaty. Most people are taught to see war as an event. Historians learn to see it as a process that mobilizes capital, reorganizes labor, concentrates authority, and redistributes wealth with remarkable consistency. Once this process is understood, a disturbing continuity emerges. Across centuries, across ideologies, across proclaimed causes, the same types of actors benefit. The same forms of wealth accumulate. The same dynasties endure. This continuity is rarely addressed directly, not because it is hidden, but because it is uncomfortable. It requires abandoning the idea that war is merely failure and recognizing it as function. In every era, conflict has created conditions unlike any other. Urgency suspends restraint. Fear overrides scrutiny. Necessity dissolves oversight. Under such conditions, decisions that would otherwise provoke resistance are accepted without question. Budgets expand without debate. Contracts are awarded without competition. Consequences are postponed indefinitely. This environment is not incidental. It is fertile. And certain families, long before the modern age, learned how to position themselves within it. They did not command armies. They did not draft manifestos. They supplied essentials: weapons, energy, finance. These three pillars, force, fuel, and funding, have always determined the material outcome of war. Those who control them rarely appear in memorials. Yet their influence is constant. The first of these pillars is violence itself. Not the act, but its means. Conflict consumes material at extraordinary rates. Powder, steel, machinery, resources transformed into force. Long before warfare became industrial, those who could supply it reliably acquired leverage beyond any battlefield. In early modern conflicts, gunpowder was decisive. Its production required specialized knowledge, access to raw materials, and the ability to scale rapidly under pressure. Those who mastered this were no longer mere merchants. They became indispensable. Indispensability is the most durable form of power. Once a state depends upon a supplier to survive, ordinary market logic ceases to apply. Price becomes secondary. Scrutiny weakens. Continuity is prioritized above all else. Contracts awarded in wartime rarely end with peace. Facilities remain. Expertise accumulates. Relationships deepen. The next conflict begins not from zero, but from infrastructure already in place. Thus, war does not create profiteers from nothing. It rewards those who prepared in advance. This principle extends far beyond explosives. As warfare evolved, so too did its requirements. The age of sail gave way to the age of steam. Steam yielded to oil. Oil to aviation. Aviation to networks of technology, logistics, and information. At each stage, a new class of indispensable suppliers emerged. They did not replace the old. They layered atop them. This layering created permanence. By the 19th century, conflict was no longer episodic. It was cyclical. Periods of fighting alternated with periods of preparation. During preparation, industries expanded quietly. During conflict, they surged publicly. Profits were not merely taken, they were institutionalized, invested into land, finance, influence, and legitimacy. By the 20th century, this process reached maturity. War had become an industry that could survive peace and benefit from its anticipation. The philosopher Seneca warned that systems which grow accustomed to excess lose the ability to recognize necessity. This applies equally to states and to those who serve them. When extraordinary spending becomes routine, it ceases to be questioned. When violence becomes abstract, its cost becomes theoretical. When profit is distributed indirectly, responsibility dissolves. This is how moral distance is created, not by denial, by complexity. Modern war is rarely experienced directly by those who fund it. It is mediated through language, images, and narratives. The human cost is honored symbolically. The economic cost is deferred silently. Debt absorbs it. Inflation conceals it. Time forgets it. Meanwhile, wealth extracted during conflict is converted into permanence. Estates, endowments, institutions. War's memory fades faster than its fortunes. This is not cynicism. It is record. Public inquiries, financial statements, parliamentary investigations all confirm the same structure repeating across generations. Different banners. Different enemies. The same financial choreography. Understanding this does not require believing that wars are fought solely for profit. That would be naive. It requires recognizing that once war begins, incentives align to ensure that it persists longer, expands wider, and ends more ambiguously than intended. Peace, in such systems, becomes economically disruptive. Disruption threatens stability. Stability protects incumbents. Thus, the machinery of conflict develops inertia, and inertia resists moral appeal. In the next stage of this inquiry, we will examine how this pattern evolved from early industrial warfare into a permanent architecture, one capable of sustaining itself even in the absence of declared war. As conflict entered the industrial age, its character changed irreversibly. War was no longer decided solely by courage, strategy, or numbers. It became a question of capacity. The capacity to manufacture, the capacity to transport, the capacity to finance destruction at scale. This transformation altered not only how wars were fought, but who truly shaped their duration and outcome. Industrialization introduced a decisive asymmetry. Armies still bled. Nations still grieved. But corporations endured. Once warfare required factories rather than forges, those who owned the means of production acquired influence previously reserved for sovereigns. This influence did not announce itself as authority. It appeared as necessity. States could not fight without railways. Railways required steel. Steel required capital. Capital required confidence. Thus, the architecture of war extended far beyond the battlefield. By the early 20th century, the decisive question of conflict was no longer who will fight, but who can sustain. Sustainment demands continuity. And continuity, once achieved, resists interruption. The emergence of large-scale armaments firms marked a turning point. These entities were not temporary suppliers. They were permanent institutions. Their facilities could not be dismantled without economic shock. Their workforces could not be dismissed without political consequence. Their knowledge could not be allowed to disperse. Thus, they became embedded. When peace arrived, it brought uncertainty, not relief. Idle factories represented risk. Unemployed workers represented unrest. Unused capacity represented loss. Preparation for the next conflict became the solution. Not openly, not cynically, but incrementally. Research budgets replaced production contracts. Maintenance replaced manufacturing. Modernization replaced mobilization. The language softened. The expenditure did not. This is how war became continuous without appearing so. The philosopher Epictetus observed that the most powerful chains are those mistaken for protection. In this period, societies came to believe that permanent readiness equaled permanent security. Yet readiness requires justification. Justification requires threat. Threat, once identified, tends to expand. By the middle of the 20th century, conflict no longer required declaration to generate expenditure. It required anticipation. Anticipation transformed fear into policy. This was the era in which technological supremacy became doctrine. Aerial power, missile systems, communications infrastructure, all demanded relentless innovation. Innovation justified funding. Funding justified expansion. Expansion required perpetuity. Thus, war ceased to be episodic. It became systemic. Corporate entities that supplied defense systems now shaped doctrine itself. They advised on requirements. They assessed risks. They proposed solutions, which they were uniquely positioned to deliver. This convergence of analysis and provision blurred a critical boundary: the distinction between necessity and opportunity. Once suppliers help define the problem, their solutions acquire inevitability. This is not collusion. It is structural convergence, and structure is more durable than intent. The concept of cost itself evolved. Traditional procurement demanded efficiency. Industrial war replaced efficiency with urgency. Later, urgency was replaced with complexity. Complex systems justified higher budgets. Higher budgets required longer timelines. Longer timelines entrenched dependency. Cost ceased to be a constraint. It became a justification. This shift was formalized through contractual mechanisms that eliminated risk for suppliers. All expenses reimbursed. Margins guaranteed. Failure absorbed by the state. In such an environment, prudence is irrational. Expansion is rewarded. Simplification is penalized. Resolution is inconvenient. War systems, once built, prefer continuation. This preference does not require malevolence. It arises naturally from institutional survival. Peace disrupts revenue. Disruption threatens employment. Threatened employment invites political resistance. Thus, even after conflicts conclude, the economic structures they created persist. They rebrand, they adapt, they wait. New rationales emerge. Deterrence, stability, humanitarian intervention. Each rationale carries moral weight. Each unlocks funding. The philosopher Marcus Aurelius wrote that power which no longer serves necessity will invent necessity to justify itself. By the late 20th century, war had become modular. Operations could be scaled without total mobilization. Conflicts could be extended without formal escalation. Costs could be financed without visible sacrifice. This modularity was revolutionary. It allowed societies to engage in prolonged conflict without experiencing it as such. No rationing, No universal conscription, no direct material austerity. The burden shifted silently into abstraction. Debt instruments, future obligations, deferred consequence. The public experienced war as information rather than deprivation. This separation was decisive. When citizens no longer feel war, resistance weakens. When resistance weakens, scrutiny fades. And when scrutiny fades, systems stabilize around their own continuation. By this stage, the war economy had matured. It no longer required fervor. It required administration. Contracts renewed, budgets adjusted, threats reinterpreted. Violence became background. The human cost remained, but distant. The financial flow remained, and immediate. This asymmetry is the core of the pattern. Those who suffer most from war are least positioned to shape its duration. Those who profit most are least exposed to its consequences. This inversion does not require intention. It emerges when distance increases and accountability diffuses. In such conditions, war ceases to shock. It becomes ambient, an accepted feature of the landscape. The question then is not why this system persists. The question is why it would ever dismantle itself. In the next part, we will examine how such a structure coexists with democratic ideals, and why public opposition rarely penetrates the economic architecture beneath conflict. A system of this scale cannot endure by force alone. It requires consent. Not enthusiastic consent, not even conscious consent, but acquiescence. The quiet acceptance that emerges when complexity overwhelms clarity and distance dulls consequence. This is how extensive war economies coexist with democratic ideals without open contradiction. The mechanism is subtle. Modern societies are not coerced into supporting perpetual conflict. They are eased into it through abstraction. War is no longer encountered as lived disruption. It arrives as language. Statements, briefings, assessments. Visuals carefully framed and temporally compressed. Violence occurs elsewhere. Decisions occur elsewhere. Consequences arrive later. The philosopher Hannah Arendt observed that the most enduring forms of power operate not through terror, but through normalization. When extraordinary actions become routine, they cease to provoke moral urgency. This is the psychological foundation upon which permanent war structures rest. In earlier eras, conflict intruded visibly into daily life. Men were conscripted, resources rationed, cities reshaped by absence. The cost of war was unmistakable. Modern conflict has been redesigned to minimize such intrusion. Professionalized forces replace mass mobilization. Financial instruments replace immediate taxation. Private contractors replace visible state action. The result is insulation. For most citizens, war is experienced as spectacle rather than participation. Spectacle creates emotion without responsibility. It allows outrage without obligation. Concern without consequence. This separation is decisive. Without personal cost, opposition loses persistence. Another mechanism is moral compression. Complex geopolitical realities are reduced to binary narratives. Stability versus chaos. Security versus threat. Action versus negligence. Such frames are not entirely false. They are incomplete. Their function is not deception, but simplification. Simplification accelerates agreement, and acceleration favors those already positioned to act. The philosopher Isaiah Berlin warned that societies become dangerous when plural truths are compressed into singular imperatives. Yet modern conflict discourse relies precisely on this compression. Time pressure discourages reflection. Urgency marginalizes dissent. Ambiguity is framed as weakness. Within such an environment, economic analysis appears cold, even improper. To ask who benefits is mistaken for cynicism. To question duration is mistaken for disloyalty. Thus, the financial architecture beneath war remains largely unexamined. Media dynamics reinforce this structure. Modern reporting depends upon access. Access depends upon alignment. Journalists embedded within military or governmental frameworks rely on official sources for information. Experts invited to interpret events often possess institutional affiliations. These affiliations do not require malice to shape discourse. Perspective is narrowed simply by proximity. Over time, a limited range of assumptions becomes dominant. Threat inflation becomes normal. Expenditure escalation becomes expected. Alternatives appear naive. This is not propaganda in the classical sense. It is epistemic drift. Knowledge circulates within bounded parameters. What lies outside those parameters becomes invisible. Another factor is economic entanglement. Defense industries are no longer isolated entities. They are woven into regional economies. They employ thousands. They sustain supply chains. They fund research. Critiquing war spending thus appears to threaten livelihoods. This creates moral hesitation. Opposition becomes abstract, while benefit is concrete. The philosopher Adam Smith noted that when economic advantage becomes localized, moral judgment becomes fragmented. Each community defends its portion of the system. The whole remains intact. Fear also plays a central role. Fear does not need to be fabricated. Uncertainty supplies it naturally. In an interconnected world, threats are diffuse and difficult to evaluate. This ambiguity amplifies perceived risk. Fear accelerates decision-making. It narrows attention to immediate danger while obscuring long-term cost. Under fear, people trade oversight for reassurance. They prefer action to deliberation. This is not irrational. It is human.
But it is exploitable.
Another crucial element is temporal displacement. The benefits of war-related industry are immediate. Contracts are signed, profits recorded, employment secured. The costs are deferred. Debt compounds quietly. Veteran care extends across decades. Geopolitical instability unfolds slowly. Those who authorize action rarely confront its full consequence. By the time costs crystallize, responsibility has dispersed. This asymmetry protects the system. No single moment demands reckoning. Instead, accumulation replaces accountability. The Stoic philosophers warned that injustice most often persists not through intention, but through postponement. When consequence is delayed, urgency evaporates. By the time the bill arrives, its origin has faded from memory. All of this produces a peculiar condition. A society that senses imbalance, yet struggles to articulate its source. People feel unease without clarity, suspicion without focus, fatigue without resolution. This unease expresses itself culturally. Distrust increases. Discourse fragments. Institutions lose credibility. Yet the underlying economic structures remain untouched because they are not where attention is directed. The war economy persists not because it is universally supported, but because it is rarely confronted as a system. Opposition addresses events. The system survives events. To challenge the system would require a different form of engagement. one that moves beyond reaction, one that insists on structural literacy. In the final part, we will turn to the most difficult question of all. What does responsibility look like for individuals who recognize this pattern but live within it? How does awareness translate into agency without collapsing into cynicism or paralysis? And what form of action remains possible when outrage has been absorbed into routine? There comes a point in every long inquiry when explanation must yield to implication, not because the pattern is incomplete, but because understanding now demands response. To recognize a structure is to inherit a question of responsibility. This is the threshold most analyses avoid. It is far easier to describe systems than to inhabit their consequences. No individual alive today designed the architecture of modern war. No single generation authored the incentives that sustain it. No solitary vote created the machinery that converts conflict into continuity. And yet, once the pattern is perceived, innocence is no longer intact. The Stoic philosophers were uncompromising on this point. They distinguished sharply between ignorance and awareness. Ignorance absolves. Awareness obligates. Obligation, however, need not imply grand gesture. It implies proportion. The error of many critiques is to imagine that responsibility must take the form of revolt or withdrawal. History suggests otherwise. Large systems rarely collapse because individuals refuse them outright. They change when individuals alter how they relate to them. The war economy does not require universal enthusiasm. It requires speed. It requires distraction. It requires unexamined assent. Remove these, and its momentum weakens. The most destabilizing force such systems encounter is not outrage. It is seriousness. Seriousness slows reaction. It complicates narratives. It demands clarity where ambiguity once sufficed. A serious citizen is difficult to mobilize emotionally. They ask for evidence rather than reassurance. They examine incentives rather than intentions. They resist urgency that cannot justify itself. This disposition does not make one adversarial. It makes one inconvenient. Inconvenience is corrosive to systems that rely on automation of consent. The philosopher Marcus Aurelius wrote that true power lies not in opposing the current, but in refusing to be carried without judgment. Judgment is the final form of agency available within complex systems. It does not require control over events. It requires control over interpretation. For individuals, this begins with orientation. Orientation toward long time rather than immediate spectacle. Toward structure rather than episode. Toward consequence rather than intention. Such orientation reshapes engagement. News is read differently. Threats are weighed rather than absorbed. Calls to action are interrogated. This is not apathy. It is discernment. Discernment reintroduces friction. Friction slows systems that depend on velocity. The war economy thrives on immediacy. Rapid escalation, accelerated funding, compressed debate. When citizens resist being rushed, momentum falters. When questions persist, narratives strain. When complexity is allowed to remain complex, manipulation loses efficiency. This is the quiet power of literacy. Not literacy of slogans, but of systems. Understanding how money flows, how contracts are structured, how risk is transferred, how accountability dissolves. Such understanding does not guarantee reform, but it renders blind continuation more difficult. History shows that even entrenched structures adapt when scrutiny becomes sustained rather than episodic. Not because they are persuaded, but because adaptation becomes necessary for legitimacy. Legitimacy is the only currency no system can manufacture indefinitely. Once legitimacy erodes, continuity requires adjustment. This adjustment rarely arrives as confession. It arrives as recalibration. Budgets change language, contracts change form. Priorities shift subtly. These changes are often invisible to those expecting rupture, but they matter. They alter trajectories. The Stoics believed that dignity lies not in preserving scale, but in preserving form. Form, in this sense, is integrity. Integrity between justification and action. Between cost and benefit. Between power and accountability. A society that preserves form through reduction survives transition. One that preserves scale through denial fractures. The future will not belong to those who shout most loudly against the war economy, nor to those who defend it reflexively. It will belong to those capable of holding complexity without surrendering judgment. Those who can distinguish necessity from habit, security from excess, defense from inertia. Such people rarely dominate discourse. They influence it quietly, through questions asked rather than slogans repeated, through standards maintained rather than loyalties proclaimed, through patience exercised rather than urgency obeyed. If you have remained with this reflection to its conclusion, it suggests a particular temperament, a resistance to simplification, a respect for long memory, a willingness to look beneath comfort. This temperament has always been rare. It has always mattered. Periods of transition do not reward the loud or the pure. They reward the composed, those capable of restraint when others demand acceleration, those capable of thought when others demand alignment, those capable of dignity when systems tempt surrender. If this work sharpened rather than reassured, that was intentional. Clarity is not comfort, it is orientation. And orientation, in an age of abstraction, is a form of quiet independence. If you believe such inquiry deserves continuation, not as spectacle, but as sustained examination, remaining connected ensures that seriousness is not drowned by noise. A measured acknowledgement allows this work to reach others who value depth over immediacy. If you choose to share it, do so deliberately, not broadly, but privately. Offer it to one person whose judgment you respect, one person capable of conversation rather than reaction. And if you leave a comment, let it contribute something, not agreement, not applause, thought. Because thoughtful exchange is how standards survive when systems grow loud. History will continue to unfold. Conflict will recur. Incentives will persist. The enduring question is whether, amid repetition, there remain individuals willing to see clearly and to live accordingly. That has always been how form outlasts power.